I'd like to lay some groundwork for concepts that will be useful in the main part of part 3, in which I'll address some mechanics of karma and reincarnation, worlds nested within worlds, gateways between worlds, things like that. And these concepts that I'll address in this video are not inherently perennialist concepts. They're really my resolution to the issue of the eidos, the issue of Platonic forms, and also the question of time, the nature of time, and indeterminacy as it pertains to identity. So these are some concepts that are really just my concepts. I can't speak to whether some other philosophers have covered this in a similar way. As far as I know, this constitutes my original thinking. So, but anyway, it will be useful to understand the main part of part 3 if you watch this, since I use my own concepts in moving forward. I mean, that's kind of the premise of perennialism, the notion that these truths are somehow embodied in us. They are our innermost substance, and therefore are accessible if you follow the proper methodology or pedagogy. So I really don't have a problem introducing new material. It's like if you're a member of a philosophical school, say you're a German idealist, and you say some stuff, now that's part of German idealism. Like, you can quote Kant and Schopenhauer and Schelling and Hegel, but when you say something original, that too is now part of German idealism. So I guess then technically this is part of perennialism. So it tautologically makes itself pertinent to the subject at hand. Okay, so to start, we're going to deal with forms, and I've already established this kind of unbounded creative source. Now, I could do a separate video on the notion of why we should conceive of the source of creation as being unbounded, or why we should conceive of reality as being fundamentally unbounded. But that would definitely go too far afield of what we're trying to talk about here. But anyway, I mean, a basic way of looking at it is that we only know the limitations that apply to our mind. And so if we're going to discuss any kind of limitation to the source of our mind, we can only ever be hypostasizing the forms of our mind. We can only ever be reifying our own modes of conception. We simply can't talk about that more fundamental noumenal realm. And therefore we have no grounds for justifying any purported limit to it. So we're going to call it unlimited. We're going to say that every willing state emanates from it. Absolutely every possibility of the will. Transcending possibility. Simply all will manifests from it. But out of that seeming chaos, all order does as well. So this has to do with the identity of will and representation. So every form corresponds to, as its inner state, a form, so to speak, of the will. A thrust of the will. I don't know what you would call it. An aspect or affectation of the will or something. But they are two sides of the same coin. So every form, like a triangle or like a pentagon, every form corresponds to, as its inner substance, a gesture of the will. The will to triangularity is the form of triangularity, is the form of the possibility of instantiated triangles. Now, my conception of a form is basically like an eidetic identity, a pattern that has the ability to reoccur in multiple contexts. And my cosmology is such that, therefore, everything is a form. Not just triangles, not just numbers, not just simple things, but you, at this moment, are a form because you might exist in a variety of possible contexts. So you could be instantiated in broader systems, diverse broader systems. All temporal forms have a locus of identity. So that will, those individual willing states that I'm talking about, only become coherent if they're subject to some kind of holographic principle which unites the several aspects of the shape in question. Like a pentagon is only unified as a willing state if all of its angles and the lengths of its sides, or the proportions of its sides, all of that is somehow brought into a kind of locus of identity, locus of perspective. And that's what a hologram is. All of the information of the hologram is contained in every part of the hologram, which means there's one informational center of the hologram. This I talked about years ago, and that this could be a resolution to the hard problem of consciousness, like how do you get experience from matter? Well, first of all, I think that conception, that naive materialist conception, is flawed, but even if you take it, you can say if there is some kind of like electromagnetic field emanating from the body, and if that field has holographic properties, then that would give you the unity of experience, which is phenomenology. Because every various thing that is part of the information of this conscious hologram, or the hologram of the information of consciousness, all of that is brought into a unity through the locus of identity at the center of awareness. And so that would apply to the pentagon as well, and any other shape, any other basic element of will is tied to, so it is particular in the slice of its will yields certain outcomes, certain shapes, certain whatever, certain feelings. But it's tied to the unlimited ground, in that unlimited ground serves as the axis on which is grafted the unity of the one in the many of the hologram. And the holographic principle in physics says that every bounded region of space, the surface area encodes the information contained in the volume of that, that space. So that's maybe a little bit difficult without getting into that in depth. And that's not the main thrust here. But the point is that all temporal forms do have a locus of identity, and beyond the scope of that identity, forms are situated against a field of possible contexts. So this pentagon here on the left, this is a form that's situated against possible contexts. And this form, in its simplicity as simply the pentagon, has a locus of identity. We're going to represent it as a center of the pentagon, but that's kind of just like analogical to what the inner feeling of being the pentagon would be, which it wouldn't involve senses. It wouldn't involve the kind of thing that conscious organisms experience. It would be kind of just the raw thrust of that being that shape in an aspatial way. And this, one of these possible contexts is the surrounding context here, which is going to be delimited not by the pentagon in its proper sense as the form of the pentagon, because there's nothing in the form of the pentagon to allow other shapes to enter in terms of perception or sensation, as I was just saying. So this wouldn't be this is the center of the original, but the locus of identity that brings this set of things together would have to be some other organism, either a living form or a complex system, like an atomic or molecular system or whatever, something that's capable of registering the impact of these shapes as being related to each other in such and such a way at such and such a distance, and also at such a distance from the locus of identity in question. So this entire field is a representation of a willing state here, and the willing state here, and the fields of representation that includes that the pentagon as an element, which is in itself a form, which is in itself a state of the will. That field is itself a form, because it and this thing too, because this unity, these are two sides of the same coin. This willing state here could itself exist in multiple possible contexts. So when I say that everything is a form, that is what I mean. That is what a form is. I don't know how I'm zooming right now, and I'm going to have to figure this out. I'm going to pause it if I can. And this might just do it. No? All right, success. That's what I mean by a form. Everything is a form, and forms stack within another. This yields a hierarchy of complexity, and that's the deal with that. There is an indeterminacy of indifference, which is a concept relating to this possible contexts deal. As long as it doesn't affect the identity of the form in question, like as long as... Okay, now I haven't used this PowerPoints with the screen capture set up before, so bear with me. I'm trying to use the draw function without bringing the draw function out. That's my problem here. So there's an indeterminacy. As long as the thing bounded... Now this is unpleasant for me at this point. This is just not so good. I'm not going to use the draw function because that's going to happen again. Is that... No. Okay. Okay. So as long as the thing bounded in that circle on the right, as long as that's not violated, as long as nothing changes there, it is indifferent to what could be surrounding it. And that indifference results in an indeterminacy. It's not determinate what's beyond it. And that results in an indeterminate nature to the systems with which we are not yet fully entangled. And so atomic systems, subatomic systems, are indeterminate because we're indifferent to the location of the electron at this moment. Maybe its charge affects us, like some elements of those basic things at the threshold of the fidelity of our image of the world, some elements of them affect us and are entangled with systems that are fully determinate from our perspective. But the elements that don't necessarily affect us result in probabilistic distributions. And I did cover that concept already in the previous video. So now I'm going to jump to time. And essentially, because we have, these are causal, or rather, these are willing states. So this is a willing state, this is a willing state, produced directly by that undifferentiated, that unbounded will, ultimate order at the same time. These states, which are durations, moments of experience, we can't exactly measure them as being of a particular length of time. It wouldn't make sense for a quantum of time to have breadth in time. It wouldn't be the quantum of time in that case. So there's kind of a fuzziness to exactly how long this is, and it's entirely possible that what constitutes the duration of a moment of time for a complex organism like us is different in terms of how it relates to a comparable set of systems than the moment of time for something like an electron. Because we are entangled with a broader region of space, because we're bigger and more complex, capable of being affected by more. So that question of the length of duration is an interesting philosophical problem. Alfred North Whitehead addresses it in Concept of Nature in a, I don't know if it's a good way, but it's definitely an interesting way. But that's kind of an element of time that I'm agnostic about at the moment. I'd be interested in studying that question more, but it's not really pertinent to the notion of time that I'm going to be talking about here, which is that, okay, so these individual states of the will, the reason we perceive a timeline, it is part of our nature, right? That we're temporal creatures. Part of my experience right now is, or my willing state is an experience of time. I have the will in this moment to experience time. So it's part of my nature. My nature is to be causally entangled with a broad system. Now, of course, I'm kind of depicting it here where this is your current sense experience. This here is your current sense experience. And then underlying that are residues of what we take to be the past. Things which are not taken to be experience of the immediate objective environment, but which, you know, are dispositions of the body, pretty much, that lead us to believe that there was something that accounted for it. We have an instinct for causality, and that's what basically understanding is that intuition for causal relationships and seeking them out and explaining things that way. That can be accounted for, that causal intuition can be accounted for as a disposition of will. So that's its origin. It stems directly from that undifferentiated. But what time is then is a semiotic structure. So that portion of us that's the residues of what we take to be the past, that acts as a signifier for the signified of this past state in question. And that signified does exist, so it's a true reference. And in that sense, you know, the semiotic chain is valid. And therefore you can also have error in terms of having a perception of, or an account of a residue that isn't actually the most probable account for your current disposition. And this is like, there are definitely interesting things philosophically with time, but this core concept is all I really need to get into for now, for the purposes of perennial philosophy. But yeah, so it's a relationship of signifier and signified, the relationship of the disposition of our body that we use as a sign that connects us to, as a referent to, a past state, and that past state equates to a real state of the will, just like this moment is a real state of the will. So there is a valid reference that that kind of justifies the causal chain, and broader causal series, processes do happen over time, and those can be seen, those processes that occur over spans of time can be seen as like fifth dimensional forms. So durations can also, or long durations, periods of time can be forms as well, because they can be situated in multiple possible contexts, which is what I'm going to get into in the next slide. But there's forms within forms. So the present duration is related to the past duration in terms of a signifier signified relationship, a semiotic chain, and that the valid chain itself, which you can think of as you over time, that is itself a form. So there's like a you outside of time, basically a fifth dimensional you that is a form that can be instantiated in multiple ways. But that is not the you that we are talking about in terms of the identity being your phenomenological identity as awareness. That fifth dimensional you would have the same Atman because the same center of awareness that's present for you now is present at every moment of your fifth dimensional existence. And so that same holographic principle, uniting the many into the one, does apply for the fifth dimensional thing. But I don't think, in terms of thinking about reincarnation and the flow of time, I don't think getting into that concept is actually relevant or entirely necessary. And so I definitely won't, because time is, I mean, Heidegger didn't even finish that book that he wrote trying to talk about being in time. And it's a long book, so it's definitely a complex topic. All right, so indeterminacy of indifference, which we talked about before, as applied to time. Like I said, there is a kind of formal nature to durations, spans of time, and beyond what affects the span of time in question, like, 10,000, 20,000, 8 million years out into the future, all sorts of different things could happen. If you take reincarnation, we're temporarily just going to accept that that's real. What I incarnate into 10 million years from now in my personal timeline, that could be practically anything. No way of telling. There is this kind of indeterminacy of things that far away. But there's not that much indeterminacy in what's going to happen, a half a second from now. If I wasn't still sitting in this chair a half second from now, if I wasn't in this room, in this house, in this state, I would be wildly surprised. There's a lot of determination going into where you're going to be in 0.5 seconds. So that linearity of time, where you're not just going to be anything in the next moment, that's predicated on a readable semiotic chain. So the meaning is what the willing state is. Even that triangle by itself, or the pentagon by itself, is a form of meaning. Meaning is will, is the form. All of these things are the same, because it's a monist system. Obviously, they have to be the same. But anyway, the readable chain is what time is. So it's a linguistic structure, reference to accounting for the current state by way of patterns observed in the here and now. So we extrapolate trends and project them backward and signify states that would have existed back then, that according to the laws that we experience now as parts of our nature now, that provide a valid explanation that. And this also has to do with the law of conservation of energy, why that would be in such a system. Because in order for the fullest accounting to be made of all the different elements of yourself, each thing has to have a correlate in the past, that not all of it is consciously made, very little of it is consciously made, but the whole structure of your physical organism is the element of your will that you are right now. And for that to fit into a semiotic chain of time, part for part has to maintain some kind of correspondence. Otherwise, that chain is just not made. Time doesn't happen, and the duration doesn't happen. But since the will is there projecting all states, anything that would have filled that gap, if, anything can happen, right? In the next 0.5 seconds, maybe I do just end up on the moon somehow. But I don't register that. Or it's very unlikely that I register that in terms of creating a coherent narrative of experience, a meaningful semiotic chain. The linearity is brief. And so there's not a lot of stability in that structure. Whereas the 0.5 seconds where everything just fits with what's going now, that's vastly more probable, because it fits more with the structure of what I am now. And all of that is there providing itself to me as an ontological possibility for the next moment. So we have this chain that's linear by way of the overwhelming probability of things basically keeping an account for themselves, the part for part correspondence of the structure in a signifier relationship maintaining itself, creating the coherence. The coherent structure itself is a form. We're not going to really treat of that here. But beyond the relevant sphere, which that line can kind of be drawn in an infinite number of ways, because you can say that the 5 from now until 5 seconds from now, that's a form. 10 seconds and then 1,000 years is itself a form. These things don't lend themselves to like easy. It's like thinking about very, very large numbers or something. It's like reality kind of seems to be that way. Math seems to be that way, but it's hard for us to wrap our minds around. So I know a lot of people do have difficulty with trying to think about this stuff, which is good because like a lot of this whole process has been scaring away the people who don't deserve to know the stuff, because you shouldn't try any of the things that you understand to be possible if if you're not prepared for it. Basically, that's why years of indoctrination. That's why regulating your conduct in particular ways according to tradition is necessary as a propaedeutic for that. Don't just jump into this stuff. So this is I'm also just justifying my obscurity in the way that I'm talking, but take that for what you will. And the illustration above is just the indeterminacy at the macro scale of where we are. So we could be in a variety of possible macro contexts, and then at the micro level, very small things could be in a number of different ways, and that indifference, that indeterminacy of indifference occurs with time as well. And not just in the future, but you'll notice I illustrate it as being a part of the past as well. Now, why this is a useful groundwork for talking about reincarnation has to do with, applied to problems of parallel timelines. For the longest time, I accepted reincarnation. And I did put up a video, or I made public a video that I made years ago, the scientific basis for reincarnation, I believe is the title. So you can find that. It should be up now. And that would explain why I accepted reincarnation loosely. But I couldn't wrap my head around how to reconcile that with the notion of the one universal Atman. Because if you have infinite time and infinite timelines, then you have divergent timelines. I say one being goes up into the heavens forever, and then another being goes down into the hells forever. It would seem that they're never going to meet again. And you would have parallel individuals. You have the avatar individual who's always perfect and never failing, and they're never going to intersect with me at all. So we have to be completely different beings. And that brings you into the territory of like Leibnizian monadology. And that's an uncomfortable territory for me to be in, because I don't think that philosophy makes a lot of sense. There are just problems that are introduced when you talk about distinct souls, unresolved, like unexplained things. But you'll notice when you introduce this indeterminacy, you don't have the same problem, because no two timelines are truly parallel. There's a possibility of them being parallel, but there's also at the same time a real possibility of them intersecting. So it's always possible, even if in a infinite line sense, two timelines like the avatar and like me right now, like even though if they were perfectly infinite straight lines, they would never intersect. If they're indeterminate, then there is a possibility of them intersecting. And that, it's hard kind of to wrap it, for me at first at least. This is a relatively recent concept for me. So, it was hard for me to accept at first. First of all, to accept that I didn't just have one past, that I might have multiple pasts. What does that even mean? Well, the indeterminacy of indifference argument I had accepted from years back, and it's a logical implication of it. You have to accept that you have multiple pasts. But basically, like, talk about like the moment of Christ on the cross, right? For him there, he partakes of the form, the fifth dimensional form of the eternal man, which would, according to the Perennial philosophy, also be like Krishna and Rama and the different avatars of God, the incarnations of the divinity. Which is to say, basically, like that temporal form that is perfectly in accordance with the nature of reality, so that perfectly obeys the law, that always speaks the truth, that acts in accordance with the truth, that somehow is the truth, is the best metaphorical representation of the truth, but also that metaphor is just, because it's a monist system, is itself, one in being with the Father, not distinct, not created, begotten. So that moment of Christ on the cross, like he partakes of the fifth dimensional eternal man, but at the same time, phenomenologically speaking, in terms of him being a reincarnating creature, which, if you're a normal Christian, you're not going to like thinking about it in that term, those terms, for a number of reasons. But anyway, if you're going to think about his phenomenological moment of the present, that will be subject to the same probabilistic field. And if it's not, and if he's just deterministically condemned to be on that flat line forever, then he can't fail. And is he really that laudable? If there is no possibility of him doing anything other than that which he did. Should we be worshiping clockwork gods is basically the question. That doesn't make sense to me. So at that moment on the cross, there is the probabilistic distribution. He is acting in accordance with the fifth dimensional form of the eternal man, but he also is open to decline, and if there was an ascension from that point, but it's kind of hypothetically the peak, so he can't ascend from there. Although he does, because he, ascends into the heavens. But anyway, and me at this moment, I have the same probabilistic. I could keep ascending and ascending, and at a certain point, I would map onto the conduct of the eternal man perfectly, but I would still be entangled with my past, which was not the perfect man. And so, within the space of the relevant semiotic temporal chain, within the space of that structure, which is a real structure encoded in the nature of my present moment, of me basically just becoming a Buddha or something. The Buddha remembers, his brain is still there. The Buddha remembers not being the Buddha. And so he can't be this eternal man kind of thing. But once he becomes the Buddha, if he sticks there for, 10 million years or through many incarnations, then his being there at that moment, he'll have the multiple pasts, and one of those pasts will become the straight line. And so he'll then map fully onto the fifth dimensional archetype of the eternal man. Really, definitely not everyday philosophical concepts that I'm going over here. Just I don't usually talk about it. I think about it all the time. Almost all the time I'm thinking about this sort of thing. Or politics or other thing. I'm a philosopher. I think philosophically, but I don't always get to talk about some of the more far out stuff. It's because I've made several videos now and gone over so many things that I feel that for the 6 of you that are still watching and who actually want to understand this, hopefully I've given you enough that if you have a 250 IQ, you'll be able to. No, I already said my IQ is not, astronomical. It's somewhere in the 140s. And, wait, is that it? Yeah, that's it. All right. So part 3, the real part 3, the main part 3 will be, I think, slightly more interesting than this and less dry. But thanks anyway for listening.